Welcome to the Sumer Sports Show. I am your host today, Tej Seth. Parker Fleming, usually my co-host on these Wednesday afternoon shows, is on a very well-deserved vacation. So just me today. Very excited with what guest we have here today. We have John Taormina. John, how are you today?
I'm doing great, Tej. How are you?
Good. Yeah. Thanks so much for coming on the show. You're one of my closest friends in all of football analytics and someone who I have a ton of respect for and a lot of people have a ton of respect for. So, very excited to talk about your career with kind of how college went for you, how you got into the NFL, working for the Falcons for as many years as you did, and then some other general football topics because like I said earlier, you really are like one of the best football minds I talk to literally a daily basis. So very excited for that. So for everyone who isn't as familiar with you, you started at Penn State doing broadcast journalism, and then you got your master's in analytics at Villanova before working for the Atlanta Falcons in their analytics department for 7 years, and now are the director of football strategy at True Media.
Yes, sir. And I will say you are also one of my favorite people to talk ball with. So it's going to be a pleasure today talking through everything. And yeah, I mean, that's my background, and I'm sure we'll get into some of that. But it's a pleasure to kind of talk to everybody today.
Yeah, no, thanks for saying that. And I love hearing about this, and we've talked about this before, but for everyone listening, like, can you just tell us like your background of like what it was like to fall in love with football when you felt like that really happened for you, and then like the whole football analytics side of things, and when that happened for you as well.
For sure. So I grew up outside Philadelphia. My family's had like Eagles season tickets since like the 60s. So when I was born, I was basically, you're going to be a Phillies sports fan and specifically an Eagles fan. So at like 5, I wanted to be the Eagles GM. I'm like, this is cool. I love these games. They've always been like relatively good throughout my lifetime. And I mean, obviously at that point, we were still in like the Ray Rhodes era. So it was a little bit of a crossroads, but was a fan kind of at the start of the Andy Reid era and just really enjoyed that. I didn't play growing up, but fell in love with kind of watching Philly sports. I love numbers. I never really thought that like at that point in time that was like, oh, I could work for a sports team doing numbers, because it was like scouting and coaching kind of were the two things. Howie kind of had made his hay in the cap world, so that was interesting to me, but I had no real concept of that being a reality. And yeah, so just kind of was a hope that as I grew up, like, and time would pass, that maybe like something like sports analytics would actually become a thing. And sure enough, it did. So that was an opportunity that I wanted to seize.
hmm Yeah, and that's really cool. I think like a lot of us, it starts off by being like a passionate fan of a team. And there I don't know if there are more passionate fans in the NFL than Eagles fans. So it's cool to see your passion from being an Eagles fans kind of carry you the rest of the way into working for football. So yeah, why don't you take everyone through like kind of how you went from your master's of analytics at Villanova to eventually working for the Atlanta Falcons for as long as you did.
For sure. So kind of when I was in undergrad, I'd heard of sports analytics. I knew it was a thing, didn't necessarily know that you could get like a degree in anything like that. So I was looking for a grad program while I was an undergrad that would be like remote in nature, where I knew like in the sports world, like obviously I wanted to work for the Eagles, but at the end of the day, when you face the reality, you're just happy and blessed to work wherever a sports team would be willing to hire you. And I didn't want to be waiting until I was finished with my grad school to entertain an internship or something like that. So started my master's program at Villanova, and like I said, it was online, and just started applying on anything I saw on Teamwork Online, pretty much. So Sixers were the first local opportunity that I saw. I applied there, applied for the Charlotte Hornets job that I saw next, which, stepping a little bit out of my comfort zone. I'm like, all right, that would be a good move. And then saw the first football opportunity that actually was posted was the Falcons one, and I kind of just jumped on it. I had started like a insurance job as a database administrator, and so I was liking that. I was actually making money. I felt like I had real resume experience, which, as anyone knows, kind of breaking into any industry, when you're in college and you have like academic experience, that's much different than having something you can put on a resume where, hey, I did this for this job. So applied for the Falcons job, got really lucky, honestly. That database administrator job I mentioned it was all SQL based. So I had like 6 weeks of SQL experience when I eventually accepted the Falcons job. And the Masters of Analytics, that's nice on paper of saying like, okay, this guy's generally qualified to do that kind of thing. But like people that I guess think that everything that's done from a coding perspective, from a data scientist world in an NFL building or most sports teams building, only being in a language like R or Python, it's like not the whole story. Like a lot of things can be done exclusively in those languages, but at the end of like central data warehouse is going to live in a SQL database. So having those skills bridge some gaps that I could help out in other areas with the Falcons. And so I was lucky enough for them to offer me an internship in the 2015 season.
For sure. And it's funny how sometimes those different journeys can kind of lead us there. Like you getting that SQL experience in a job outside of sports instead of initially jumping into it, like might have or definitely really helped you in your job with the Falcons. And so, yeah, when you started there and that season that you were a part of the team, and then you kind of worked your way up and ended up wearing like a ton of different hats in Atlanta, and were doing a lot of things. How was it to kind of be like one of the early people in the analytics department and kind of creating the department as it grew along?
I mean, it was a dream fun experience because it was one of those things where obviously anyone's going to be happy to be a part of any organization. But when we came in, it was just a truly blank slate. So there's a lot of patience because there wasn't necessarily expectations we were being held to. And two, just you could be creative and just like start to work with, all right, what do you guys think's interesting? Kind of go to the drawing board. As the CEO of Sumer Sports, Thomas Dimitrov, he was my GM there. So he was very inviting of like, hey, let's get creative. Dan Quinn, the head coach as well. I was very blessed. I would say I wouldn't have had the opportunity to grow the department the way we did without them kind of embracing it from the get-go of this is new, but it's not going to be something that's an adversarial relationship at all. Like ultimately we want to build a winning organization. So this is now going to be a part of that. And they were invested in kind of spending time with teaching me things that maybe I didn't know from not playing and introducing me to their staff of like, hey, this is JT. And the coaches would know, here are the ways that we're kind of wanting you to work with him. And then the scouts would also know, and then they'd just come visit you, right? And you start to form those relationships. And so, yeah, it was really cool, honestly, just being a part of the team. Like at the end of the day, like it's just a dream that anybody would have, like, oh, I'm a part of the organization. And then as you build those relationships, you start to show value. And then eventually you need more people, right? So we showed like, all right, this is the proof of concept of here's ways that we can save coaches time and provide the same types of insights that they're trying to spend hours to find, maybe automated on Mondays or eliminating efficiencies in the draft and working with cap and contracts people on kind of helping with contract negotiations. And so as all of those areas are starting to take an interest in a department of one at that point in time, we were kind of forced to grow throughout the years. And then also looking around the league, like every GM wants to make sure, or the GMs that care anyway, like Thomas, want to make sure that like if that's an area they care about, like they want to be a leader in that area. So it was important kind of like seeing other like maybe organizations that had a head start, that if there's some ways that we can make ourselves a part of that crowd of winning organizations.
Mm-hmm. For sure. And yeah, I think that's like the key type of things is like the crossover between the analytics people and the non-analytics people. And that's been a common theme of some of the guests that we've talked to on this show throughout the summer, like Sean Syed and Cody Alexander and others, is how can these teams really invite the analytics people into kind of what they were so used to already doing with how they do scouting and how they do the draft and how they game plan. And like once they realize that it's pretty advantageous to have an analytics staff of, at least a couple people that can help you do all that stuff, it can really save you time and give you just advantages across the board in so many different areas. And something that I think is so interesting that you did was you had to be specialized in so many aspects of football, in college to pro scouting, in pro evaluation, in cap and contract. What was it like to kind of pick up on all of those things while you were in Atlanta?
I mean, ultimately, when you're just like make an active commitment to listening to these people and going through maybe one whole cycle, like everyone has great ideas, but no one can really have a very impactful idea without at least like being a sponge for a year and seeing like, all right, teams win Super Bowls every single year. There's a champion. So there's these winning processes that existed since the beginning of time. And then the areas kind of present themselves as you pay attention, like, oh, well, at the end of the day, when you would introduce analytics into an organization, the processes kind of stay the same, if you will. It's like the insight that comes out of those processes is either better or faster, if you will. So you don't want to negotiate differently fundamentally, but you want to have better information when you're negotiating. You're like, oh, well, maybe if we provide them with better metrics that maybe the agents don't have access to, that internally we believe in, that's an area that we can provide value there. And in the draft, you guys have all this information that data providers are providing you with. We can kind of hack through all of that. You guys are basically already telling us you're already dealing with too much information. Well, what if I told you these concepts could eliminate you having to be very wide in the amount of information that you're trying to consume to make these decisions? It's consuming the information in similar ways, like a neural network, for example, of like talking about, or a decision tree or something that you can explain, like, this is the process that you're following for the draft. It's going to do very similar things, just like any draft has its busts. It has its people that were picked in the 5th round that nobody necessarily thought were going to be successful. A model is never going to be perfect either, but you're kind of both trying to arrive at the same point of, here's very parallel processes. Here's the one that you guys have always been doing, whether it's scouting or coaching. And then here's other things that analytics can kind of add to that process.
For sure. And yeah, I really like thinking about it from like a decision tree standpoint of what are kind of the different tweaks and different paths you can go down to get to this optimal outcome that everyone in the organization wants to get to at the end of the day, which is winning. And I think that's really cool that you put it in that type of analogy.
They bought into that type of stuff too, like at positions where there's not one mold, right? Like a corner or a receiver, there's slot guys and there's outside guys. Those are two very different molds, quote unquote, that you're looking for. That's what those things are meant to do. So just like the fact that it fit with, yes, we are looking at different traits for different types of these positions, you can kind of model for those things.
Yeah, for sure. I like that a lot. And yeah, I think that's really interesting. And yeah, before we get into to talking some actual, ball here, I just got to ask one thing. Like, did it ever hit you, like, when you were in the facility, you're like, wow, I'm standing next to Julio Jones right now, or like, I'm sitting in the same room as Matt Ryan. Did that ever like get old on you, or was it always kind of like, just super excited to be there all the time?
I mean, it never got old in the sense that you're just always excited to be there. One, they're always just fun people to be around. Like, they're always going to be team-minded people, so they make the atmosphere good. I mean, it was one of the most unique work environments you could have. I've heard Adam mention it on a prior episode with his time with the Cowboys. Like, you bump into players at lunch, and like, they're just normal guys, so it's awesome. You're like, you look up, because I'm by no means tall, so I'd look up to some of these guys and be like, oh my gosh, you're Julio or you're Matt Ryan, and like they'll just like ask you, well, what did you order? Like something random, or like a linebacker will comment on like, oh, that grilled cheese looks good, and it's just like, they're normal people, right? So you get to like interact with them, and then eventually it became where they weren't like not like special, if you will, but you felt more comfortable like embracing the fact that you shouldn't feel awkward, like kind of sharing a lunchroom with those guys. You are all part of the team. And like I said, the two leaders, Dan Quinn and Thomas, instilled that culture in those guys. So I would say in most building, that's the case, and these guys are going to be friendly with you. But it was still always cool when you just like run into them like 4 feet away. You're like, that's something that I would have killed for as a fan growing up. And it's different than being a fan. That's why I say like it does get a little bit different, where you start to feel like, we called it under DQ, like the brotherhood, where like you're all part of one thing, and like we have our roles, right? They're the ones who are playing the game on Sundays, but we treat each other with respect. And so that was like honestly cool. And as I mentioned, like everyone's team minded. So it's like, if you are going to be successful at that level, I feel like that's a prerequisite. Like that, the people that are selfish root themselves out and don't necessarily have to make it to that level. So it's like no coincidence, right? Like that feels like a special atmosphere because it's filled with special people, in my opinion. So it was just really cool I talk about Dan Quinn. He's one of the best like human mentors I've ever had, as like, forget like football, just being like a guy. I mean, Thomas as well, but like those are the types of things that you spend enough time with those people in that building every day, and you do form relationships beyond football with them, which is pretty cool.
For sure. Yeah, no, that's really cool. And like when we talk about, so yeah, let's talk about the 2016 Falcons, which is like truly like a masterpiece that Thomas, co-host of this show on Mondays with Eric, helped put the team together along with Kyle Shanahan as offensive coordinator, Dan Quinn as defensive coordinator, like you mentioned, and just like talent like all across the board on the coaching staff and on the players. So 2016 Falcons, third best offense using EPA per play from 2014. Personally, my favorite offense that I've ever watched in any college or NFL. Chip Kelly's Oregon offenses are up there, but 2016 Falcons offense was amazing. And then like when you just look between the 20s, which we're big proponents on, and we can talk about that later, they were the best offense in using EPA per play because of that. And you have Matt Ryan MVP season. Overall, he had the seventh best EPA per play of any quarterback season since 2014. And like the really impressive thing about it is in 2015, Matt Ryan was 11th in EPA per play. He went to first in 2016 and then to seventh in 2017. So like very good quarterback across his whole career. But you could see this 2016 season was really special to a lot of people in this organization. So when was the moment for you when you realized that this team like really had the chance to be special?
I mean, so I would say that offseason, to be honest with you. So the first year, everyone kind of talked about Kyle's offense. It's the greatest system that kind of exists currently, if you will, or like it's up there. That it's hard for a quarterback to learn that and master it in 1 year. So there was like tempered expectations for the 2015 offense that, hey, Matt can play at an MVP caliber level in this offense, and then ended up doing so. But it's going to take some time for him to learn, all right, not only are these good plays, but here's kind of how it accentuates his strengths, and Kyle learning Matt as well. So that offseason, just the free agency period felt great. We felt like we filled some gaps that maybe couldn't be filled all in 1 year of rebuilding a team. We think we claimed Taylor Gabriel at the cut down, and that was someone that Kyle was very big on. He had spent his time in Cleveland with him, I think, for a season. So he had known like that's a guy that I could utilize in a very specific way. And then just watching that offense, I'm like, okay, this is what they've been telling us, that like just wait for year two. And obviously, like you mentioned, Matt wins MVP. Kyle calls one of the most historic offenses of all time. And yeah, accentuated, in my opinion, my favorite receiver to ever watch play. I know you have your thoughts on Megatron, but just those two, I mean, those two alone. But when he's humming, Julio was great to watch, and he set records that year from an efficiency standpoint. And as you mentioned, like just seeing, we were always like watching from the press box, like the minute the possession started, you'd blink and we'd already be in the red zone. And that was one thing that we always talked about. Kyle wasn't necessarily like the most efficient red zone play caller, but we were always down there. So if you're down there 10 times a game, you're going to be putting up 35 kind of without really blinking. So it was just a great experience. And then I know like people that were Falcons fans of that season, like we were very much like the cardiac kids, where there was games where we would almost blow a lead. Obviously we had the Super Bowl that we experienced, but during the first half of the year, the defense wasn't necessarily like a well-oiled machine. It had its holes, right? The offense was humming the whole time. And at the bye week, I believe actually DQ took over play calling going forward, and the defense, it changed. If you look at, I should have pulled it before this, but if you would look at like points per game splits for pre-bye week and post-bye week in terms of allowed, I want to say we probably cut it by about 10 points per game. And that was like just somewhat accentuating some things that we had talked about. Like this was probably the coolest part was, I think if you would also look, we played a little bit more man coverage in the second half of that season. And analytically, if you look, we were very successful when we played man coverage in the first half of the year. But in that Seattle defense, you don't necessarily like, that's not your bread and butter. It's that cover three. So that was more like your change of pace. But being closer to like a more like even split ended up kind of being the recipe for that defense to cook going into the playoffs. And that was probably at that point where like we got a chance to take this thing to the finish line. So it was cool.
Yeah, I mean, you can really see the difference with the defense when you just look at like the 2016 Falcons schedule. The first 10 weeks of the season pre-bye, there was only one game where the opposing team scored less than 20 points, and then after the bye, the seven or the 6 games that happened after that, only 2 games where the opponent scored over 20 points. So the defense really clamped down the second half of the season, and I think it really all like came to an inflection point in that game against the Packers, where the Packers come in, and it's like, as someone watching as a Lions fan, like I was rooting for the Falcons because I didn't want the Packers to go to the Super Bowl, but like I do remember being nervous going into that game, and there was something just like really special about the way that you guys came out in that game, where you could tell based on the first like two possessions that the Falcons were going to be headed to the Super Bowl based on how the offense went down the field on those first two drives, and then how the defense dialed up these pressure packages on Rodgers and really forced him to not like go through his typical process. So what was it like to prepare for like a really deep playoff run, and especially that Packers game?
I mean, the Packers game, I almost remember, I don't want to be wrong on this, but I do feel like this was the tendency that man pressure was what Rodgers struggled against that year. And that's something that you got to be bold to go in with a game plan against number 12, with that being, all right, we're going to man up and send pressure and not let him beat you. But that's kind of what he struggled against, that his guys weren't necessarily breaking open. And we weren't afraid to kind of throw the house at him, if you will. Mm-hmm. And we knew like our offense could be dominant right out the gate. So let's try and put them away in the first quarter and just kind of set the tempo. And we were confident we had that run going into the postseason. And yeah, I feel like that postseason was a blur, almost getting to the Super Bowl, that like it felt very, very just, we were playing our best ball in those games. And that's what you want, right? And that's ultimately how teams end up getting to the Super Bowl. And then even through the first half of that game, we were, doing something very similar to the Patriots. So it was definitely a dream to be a part of a run like that.
Mm-hmm. For sure, yeah, and I mean it's just it's really cool like seeing like a roster come together like the Falcons did that year, where you have Matt Ryan, like we mentioned, has always been a good quarterback, but like in that Kyle Shanahan offense, like really took it to the next level. Julio Jones had the highest yards per route run of any receiver in any season that we have that data for, which is really impressive. But then, like you mentioned, like Taylor Gabriel like was third in receiving yards for the Falcons that year. Mohamed Sanu was second, and then on the other side of things, like Devontae Freeman was really good, especially in that Packers game that we were just talking about.
And we had the great 1-2 punch with him and Tevin Coleman. Mm-hmm. And that was another thing, that using those guys in the passing game was something Kyle was very good at doing, that we had just that nice collection of weapons, that it was a perfect kind of recipe to let him cook.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And yeah, like Kyle Shanahan was obviously amazing play calling wise, and ended up getting the 49ers job. But like the rest of the staff, I think, was really impressive. Like, how did you feel about working with the staff? I know you wanted to touch on some of the names here.
Yeah, I was going to say, I tweeted this the other day, that it's like the greatest staff of all time. Mm-hmm. But I mean, on both sides, like give credit to Thomas as well, because he put together, I'll talk about them first, like the scouting staff that we had that year. Our assistant GM was Scott Pioli, and that he's a former GM. We had two other former GMs, Rustin Webster and Phil Emery, as a part of that scouting staff. So, I mean, I'd say, make no mistake, like we had the right guys putting eyes on assembling the talent for that roster. One of our lead kind of college scouts at the time, I believe he was a national scout or maybe director of college scouting for that season. Anthony Robinson is now assistant GM of the Titans. So that was someone who kind of was from that original staff. And so, yeah, a lot of scouting kind of prowess in that staff. And then when you talk about the coaching staff, I mean, some people probably have heard these names, but I don't know that everyone's aware that they were all on this staff together. So I kind of have it written down. So we've got DQ as the head coach, and he's now defensive coordinator of the Cowboys. We've got Raheem Morris was the wide receivers coach actually at that point, and assistant to the head coach. And he flipped over, I want to say it was in 18, to the defensive side of the ball, and now is defensive coordinator of the Rams. The linebackers coach that year was Jeff Ulbrich. He's now defensive coordinator of the Jets, which that's kind of like Salah wanted somebody to kind of call that Kyle defense, or the Kyle defense that was inherited and changed from DQ, if you will. That's kind of the tree. And so then flipping over to the offensive side of the ball, we talk about Kyle. He was the OC. He's a head coach. We've got the two offensive assistants, the Mikes, we called them. We had Mike McDaniel and Mike LaFleur, or the two offensive assistants. So McDaniel, head coach of the Dolphins. LaFleur, offensive coordinator, used to be with the Rams used to be with the Jets and now with the Rams. And then just a shout out to one of my buddies, offensive line intern Justin Outen that season, has now worked his way up. He was the OC in Denver last year, and he's now the run game coordinator in Tennessee. So, I mean, I'd say some of that has to do with like teams wanting people that, one, are great people, 2 are great minds, and 3 can bring that system with them places.
Mhm.
But there's some people that are successful at doing that. There's others that aren't. So, I mean, when all in all, I mean, we've got 3 current head coaches from that staff, 3 current defensive coordinators from that staff, and then like 1.5 offensive coordinators, if you will. So just a very impressive coaching tree that was a part of that 2016 year.
Yeah, I mean, when you lay it out like that, like it really is crazy how many people were on that staff that are like still coaching in the league. We know like how hard it is to sustain being a coach for so many years. And Kyle Shanahan has had a ton of success with the 49ers, making it to multiple NFC championship games. Matt LaFleur as well has had a lot of success as head coach. And even Mike McDaniel in his 1 year as head coach of the Dolphins has already shown that he's one of the better offensive minds in the league. And like, it's really cool to see that it all like stems from this 2016 Falcons team that was already just so high powered on offense, but like that makes it even cooler when you find that out.
I think I skipped Matt. I might have when I mentioned he was quarterbacks coach that year, but
Oh
yes.
yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, it was impressive and really like, I mean, credit to them because it's not an easy system to kind of master and bring with you other places that they really have been lucky to study it, but then they've earned those opportunities, I'd say, to be successful in these other spots.
Yeah, for sure. And something that Cody Alexander talked about a couple weeks ago when he was on was like the heavy quarters defense usually takes like 2 years to learn. And so defenses that played a lot of quarters last year that it didn't work well for them, like the Browns or the Packers, you should expect some positive regression with them this year because of that. And I think that like the Shanahan system is kind of similar in a way where like Matt LaFleur's first year with the Packers, like their record was really good, 13-3 in 2019, but like their offense actually wasn't that good. And it took until the second year where Rodgers ended up winning MVP and was able to do that back to back. And Shanahan had some quarterback issues early on with the 49ers, but eventually got the ball rolling over there. And like that I guess that makes it even more impressive what Mike McDaniel was able to do with the Dolphins last year, where they were able to have such an efficient offense in his first year as head coach.
No doubt. And then also just like being adaptable too, because if you look at the 3 defensive guys from that staff, they are calling some more quarters in their own places now. And that was not a staple of the Atlanta defense that we were running. So studying things like what Cody brings up and acknowledging if this is something that's going to work in today's NFL, like we would be foolish to not incorporate into our playbooks. I believe the Jets under Ulbrich probably call one of the most quarter heavy defenses in the league, if I were guessing. So
yeah, no, they do have the highest rated quarters in the league, and that like that's very impressive job by Ulbrich, and like Morris and Quinn have like really gained a lot of respect in I think a lot of people's eyes because they are now calling defenses that aren't necessarily like their backgrounds, and they were able to adapt. Like Morris was given like Brandon Staley's defense that was like super heavy too high after being like a mostly single high guy and was able to adapt and help the Rams win a Super Bowl. And then Dan Quinn as well with the Cowboys defense where he's doing a lot of things that you wouldn't expect from the typical Dan Quinn, like when you think about the 2013 Seahawks and that forward and like the 2015 Falcons and forward, like what you would expect from him. He's calling simulated pressures at the highest rate in the league, and he's running a lot more quarters and cover 2, like you mentioned, and really just changing up his defense. So yeah, the adaptability there is definitely key between these coaches, I think.
no doubt.
Yeah. So yes, now that we talked about the Falcons and yeah your experience there and kind of like what you were able to do to make them very pretty analytically focused, and you definitely saw that in a lot of the team building and game planning things that they're doing. Are there other staffs around the league that really stand out to you right now that you think are listening to the analytics staff more than most?
Yeah, I mean, shout out to you. I think you tweeted about it. The NFC East is kind of making this like a race of their own this
Hmm.
off season and kind of just lately. I mean, most people know like Philly's been a organization that for 20 years probably have had from the top down just an investment in like that's something they wanted to push. They've always had, say, one of the bigger staffs in the league. A few years ago, the Giants really made a commitment to making that a part of the organization. I'd say so. Those two kind of had the biggest head start in that division, but if you look at kind of Seth Walder and the people out there on Twitter, the Cowboys and Commanders both hired several people this offseason, and are also committing in that area. The new ownership for the Commanders kind of shift things that they're probably going to be more invested in that area. So in that division, I'd say far and away is the most complete in terms of like being progressive analytically. Baltimore and Cleveland, obviously, I'd be remiss to not mention them. They're franchises that have always had larger staffs and buy-in from kind of the top down. And so those would be the ones I'd say that people talked about the most, being Philly, Baltimore, and Cleveland, I think, throughout the years. I'm biased. I think in Atlanta, they have a pretty good setup. I mean, because I would say your analytics setup or the impact is only as good as how relatable it is to the operation, like from whether it's coaching or scouting, and like the way that we were able to organically grow something that is truly impactful. I would say they're definitely above average, top 10, top 5, if I'm going to be biased. And then like 3 others that I'll throw out there that I think get some love, maybe some misunderstanding. But I think that from my opinion, they're definitely moving in the right direction would be Minnesota, Buffalo, and Jacksonville are kind of the 3 that I think. Like Jacksonville, I'll start there just with Doug Peterson. Obviously, he has his Philly roots, and I think ownership-wise, they've also got their roots in being invested in analytics. So I'd say that there's probably more being done there than is talked about, if you would. And Buffalo just feels like they're always doing smart things, right? And I know they have smart people up there, so I would not be shocked if they've got a pretty good thing going. And then Minnesota hiring Kwesi, and then kind of just the investment that they've put forth in making decisions more analytically based. I mean, we've seen some of them this offseason. Shout out to my girl, Emily Batis, that's up there as well. So she came from the analytics space and is now in the cap and contracts world for them. So putting people from very traditional analytics roles in less traditional analytics roles is something that I think winning progressive analytics organizations will start doing. So those would be some of the ones I would say for sure.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, you truly are like one of the most connected people in the NFL analytics space on the team side. So when you mention like teams that are using analytics, like I'll always listen to that. And yeah, I mean the NFC East arms race I think is like kind of the craziest thing of this offseason right now from an analytics perspective, because you have all the success that the Eagles had last year with their analytics staff, which is pretty big in number, and you can see their effect both in team building, what they're able to do with contracts, the types of players that they draft and how they draft them, but also like the game planning. Like you can see that the Jalen Hurts push play, for example, is something that they like leaned into throughout the season because they knew how high of a success rate it would be for them. And like the Cowboys, Jerry Jones, they definitely seem to have taken notice of that and are building their staff, hiring 3 people this offseason. And then everything else you mentioned, the Commanders, new ownership, we could see more buy-in there. And obviously the job that Ty Sime is doing with the Giants as well is going to make that division really interesting. And it already is like the best division in the NFC, just on paper from like a roster perspective. But now you have all these analytics people making their way there too, which should make the game planning pretty interesting this year.
No doubt. And I mean, some of the best fan bases in the league, so they're all for it too, as I know, kind of sitting in Philly again.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, talking about game planning now, like yeah, like we mentioned earlier, like when you work as an analytics staffer in the league, you have to do so many things, like and learn so many things between contracts and team building and game planning. And so when you look at game planning specifically, what are some of the edges that you think that teams can use right now to put themselves ahead of the ball if like personnel was pretty even across the league? What are some things that they can do from a game planning perspective to give them an advantage?
I mean, either make it harder for your opponent to know what you're doing or make it easier for your opponent to make a mistake. So just those are the 2 fundamental ways that like you win a play, right? Every coach talks about, did we win or lose that play? So the former, in terms of making it harder for them to know what you're going to do, we've talked about it before, but being like more diverse in your play calling in terms of, all right, if you are only a basic 2 coverages that you're going to call in a game, well, then the offense also knows that's really the only 2 things that they have to game plan for. So, I mean, flip a coin at best, they're going to be right 50% of the time, but that's the bar they're working from. So introducing a 3rd or a 4th coverage makes a defense harder to figure out. And then the flip of that on the offensive side of the ball, being more diverse personnel wise was kind of my favorite thing. And just like learning that from, if I would like reverse engineer study what made Kyle's offense great, he was very diverse in the way he called a game, and that his game plan might have 5 different personnel groupings featured and pretty evenly distributed, that maybe we might be, I don't know, 20-30% in a few of them, but all of them would be more than 10 in a given game plan when the game's kind of going well and you can kind of stick to the script. Mm-hmm. That comes down to, if at the end of the day a defense is going to prepare for you by personnel, well, they don't have like more time to prepare for more personnel, so there's going to be some sacrifice that goes into that game plan. And so you're just kind of like taking advantage of what you know that they have to do, and then just not being afraid to be successful when you do that on game day.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Yeah, that definitely makes a lot of sense. And yeah, well, we can dig into the personnel staff after this ad read brought to you by Circa Sports. So, just wanted to let everyone know that the biggest pro football contest in Las Vegas is back for its 5th year. Circa Million and Circa Survivor, with 14 million in guaranteed prizes. So, at Sumer, we can't bet, but I think this is a really good opportunity for everyone out there to do that. You can enter in Vegas while you're in Vegas at the Circa Sportsbook, but then you can play from anywhere. So if you go to circasports.com, you can get more details on this contest. I think it's something really cool. When Eric, the host of the show on Mondays, was at PFF, it was something that him and his PFF forecast co-host George Chahuri would always play in. So, definitely something to check out. Just select one team each week with no point spread, and once you're in Vegas to sign up, and you should be set from there. So, yeah. So, John, let's get back to talking about kind of this game planning perspective on how this can really help teams. So yeah, the personnel diversity, I agree with you. And once you kind of showed me the data on that, it really opened my eyes on how teams can take advantage of that. Are there specific teams this year that you are expecting to be more, let's say, like personnel diverse than the average NFL team?
I mean, my former Atlanta Falcons definitely, I feel like, are making their own flavor of that, and especially with, as you talk about, their like very chameleon-like personnel, where what do you call Cordell Patterson, or what are you going to call Kyle Pitts, that they'll do, I'm sure they'll do things like, well, on defense is going to like tag this as 12 personnel, but we're really running a play that's like traditional 11 personnel, or just random things where at the end of the day, when you're doing a breakdown as a staff, like you need to be correct about what the offense is doing or what the defense is doing. Well, if you don't really truly know, and Coach Smith is responsible for like, well, Cordell's a receiver on this play, or those types of things, it's going to be difficult, I think, for teams to like really figure out, what do we label these things? I know when we played the Saints, it was always, what do you call Taysom Hill? Like he was a second quarterback, but there were a lot of times where they're just truly using him as a tight end. So do you label him just as a tight end when he's aligned at tight end? And just like having those questions, I think, is an interesting way. And ultimately what that comes down to is the game plan's dictated on the information that they know about the play is accurate, and then they're going to act accordingly. Well, if it's not accurate, then the defense might make a mistake. And as I mentioned kind of a few minutes ago, that's the other way that you like do well on a play. Like an average play is going to work if the defense makes a mistake. So that was another thing that, besides like personnel, like using things like motion or play action or really anything to manipulate a defense that maybe 9 times out of 10, they'll stay true to their assignments. But that one time that they have a blown assignment, I mean, you're just kind of eating off of wide open territory on that play. So.
Yeah. And yeah, like you mentioned, like motion is free. Play action gives you like a discount and puts you kind of ahead like with an advantage there. So yeah, I definitely like using all that stuff. And yeah, I kind of put this out somewhat as a joke, but also somewhat seriously, is like, I do want to see the Falcons just lean into like 31 personnel this year. Like you have Kyle Pitts, Drake London as your tight end receiver, and then like you could throw out Bijan Robinson, who we know can catch, Cordell Patterson, who we know can catch as well, and Tyler Algier, who's a pretty good running back in his own right, led the NFL in EPA per rush last year actually, and it was okay in rushing yards over expected. And so it would be really cool to see like a defense try to handle like all these different like pieces that the Falcons have.
No doubt. And you or Eric or somebody tweeted about it, that a team like that, or maybe it wasn't one of you, but a team like that is very hard to prepare for game to game in the regular season, because they're just different. Like it's not like something that you're used to preparing for. But then will they, if they have a successful season, like kind of how does that translate into the postseason? Maybe it was talking about the Ravens kind of offense, or something like that, where it's just harder to evaluate them. Like it's very hard to stop on a game-to-game basis because that's not what you're used to preparing for. That leads to like what we were just talking about, 31 personnel. Like a defensive coordinator is likely not going to have like, I'm always going to call cover three or I'm always going to call quarters, but they have kind of their go-tos in those less often used personnel, where against like 11 and 12, they'll be more dynamic of knowing I can get away with playing man coverage here, or I can get away with a simulated pressure or a drop, whatever it is. Whereas the more niche personnel groupings in the league, like you can't be that dynamic against all of them, where you're going to put your players in spots that they're just not like. You're having a linebacker match in man coverage who never does that because that's just not his responsibility. That doing weird personnel groupings like 31, one, you're putting a lot of great athletes on the field together, but two, like you just, what's the defense going to do? They're either potentially going to make a mistake or they're going to be very like vanilla in the defense that they call against you. So that's an area to exploit, I would say, probably.
Mm-hmm. For sure. And yeah, you touched on the Ravens a little bit. And, like, that's what I thought. Like, obviously, Lamar Jackson was amazing in 2019, but like also something that like they did that I thought was really special was you just had the Rams primarily playing 11 personnel in 2018, go to the Super Bowl, in large part because of it, and then like the league was starting to prepare for like this 11 personnel revolution because we know that it's somewhat of a copycat league, and the Ravens come out in 2019 and heavy 12 personnel, 13 personnel at times, with the three tight ends out there. And like, while defenses were all ready to prepare for 11 personnel, it was just so much different to be diverse. And like, when you look at like, people put out clustering graphs on scheme diversity, like the more diverse these offenses are, like you'll see the Chiefs and the Ravens and the Bills, like teams that are perennially, and obviously the 49ers, like teams that are almost always at the top of offensive rankings are also going to be try to be more diverse, while like some of these like heavy 11 personnel teams that use an average rate of motion, an average rate of play action, just fall into the same bucket that make it really easy to prepare for.
No doubt. And not only that, but literally like you don't want to like forget that the scouting side reacts to that too. So like every scouting staff's now built their defense, if you will, to be a nickel defense heavy of like when they're in 11 personnel, we have the best nickel that we can match with. Well, that's like an inefficiency that wasn't true 5-10 years ago. So maybe it was harder to run the ball, right? Well, now when you do like kind of shift to a less traditional offense, or today now a less traditional offense, and you are in those run heavier personnel, not only are you literally facing lighter people because the 53-man roster is more constructed to be like a nickel down defense, if you will. But so that makes your runs more effective. But then you're in those like situations where then maybe they do try to match in like a very vanilla based defense and you exploit them with play action and things. So it's a zig to the zag that the personnel people are doing too, that ultimately, if you know the design of the league's 53 man has shifted in one direction, play calling shifting the other way is going to exploit that.
Yeah, and that's like the thing that gave Bill Belichick, I think, his edge in team building for so long was since like the league was trying to play catch up to like the Patriots specifically for the better part of a decade, he was always able to stay one step ahead of the curve when it came to shifting his defensive personnel, when it came to shifting his defensive formation, based on where the league was going. And I think it's really all about when you can do diversity, uniqueness, like all of those things together can really make for these people that have to game plan, these coordinators, really give them a difficult time, I think, is like the main goal of all of that.
No doubt.
Yeah. So let's talk about some other stuff that I know that we talk about a lot. So in regards to like the cap side of things, now that we've talked about game planning, and something that's been brought up but should be mentioned again is like the Browns are spending the most cash this year on their roster, while everyone has to play under the rules of a cap because of things you can do with void years to certain contracts and restructures where you can just kind of keep rolling money back. However, it's really the guaranteed money that gets paid out plus whatever else you want on the cap, and then the rest of the stuff you can pay out in cash. and keep it. So that needs buy-in from your ownership. But what are some other advantages, or if you want to talk about that advantage more, that you see teams doing from a cap perspective?
I mean, it's void years is the trendy thing
Mhm.
that's everyone's doing, like, because they can manipulate the cap part of it as long as the cash is there. I mean, that's, if you look at studies of like teams that are doing void years over the last, let's say 6 seasons or 7 seasons, it's like 7 seasons ago, it was like 3 teams. And now it's like 2/3 of the league, if not more. I haven't looked at it recently, are using void years in their contracts. And so that's, I'd say, the trendiest thing. And then also, I think getting smarter about certain, I mean, we see it with Saquon right now. He's talking about not wanting to play on the franchise tag versus wanting a long-term deal, getting smarter about utilizing like shorter deals that, as long as kind of we have the cap there, you can utilize it, or the cash there, you can utilize a shorter deal and then just like exploit the cap however you want to spread that out with void years or whatever it may be. That you don't ultimately need to be signing kind of those like 6 and 7 year deals at some positions, because teams treat them as like 3 year deals anyway. You can kind of ostensibly have the same structure, but in a shorter actual deal. And that's more amenable to the player too, because he ends up getting slightly more of his actual money, and it's not kind of fake money in years that they'll never achieve.
Hmm. Yeah, and yeah, I think yeah, like you really saw this being used a lot. Like I think the Eagles were one of those like three teams that you mentioned that were using this previously because of Howie Roseman's background, and then seeing like how that's kind of worked and then spread across the league has definitely really been interesting. It like really has changed how free agency works now, how contract reporting works. Like now when a player signs, you can't take their initial contract that gets reported on face value, like the Geno Smith contract, for example, which was like reported as 3 years, 75 million, but like is actually like a 1 or 2 year deal. When you dig into the contract, I think has really changed the way that everyone kind of has to like care about contracts and the discourse about them now.
No doubt. I mean, you guys have talked about this in the past, but I'd love to see something similar happen with the rookie wage scale, or just
Hmm.
abolishing the draft or something, because that's where, like, you really, at the end of the day, there's not much efficiency in the pro market, right?
Hmm.
The dollars are, they spend themselves at the end of the day in a lot
Yeah.
of these negotiations. So it's less exciting, really.
Hmm. Yeah, and yeah, I definitely agree with that. And like that's why I think yeah, free agency is like a very efficient market at the end of the day. Like the supply and the demand is there for players and on the team side, and players occasionally do take like a hometown discount or a special circumstance discount, but like usually they'll take fair value that's offered to them to make sure that they get that. And you know there are some drawbacks of like how running backs are being treated in the market, or how certain value or certain positions might get valued eventually down the line, that the NFL should or might consider fixing. But yeah, like the draft at the end of the day is just something that a lot of teams are taking advantage of, because most players that get drafted will end up outperforming their contracts. So if you go back to pre 2011 CBA, maybe you have something involved where their players negotiate their contracts after getting drafted, or you have some type of other scale in place, or some type of other system in place. But I think it'll be really interesting to see how they handle that, especially to help running backs, like we talked about earlier, like make sure that they're getting enough wages while they're in the prime of their career, which is just happens to be the usually the first 4 years of their career.
Yeah, the thing that I've always wondered, and I don't know that we've really ever talked about it internally, was the why there's just like no player options. Like,
Mm-hmm.
and other sports, player options are a thing. And if you really took it like all the way, then make the 4 year draft contract just a player option every year. And if you want to opt out after your rookie year, okay, so be it. Like, that's on you. And at that point, like, yes, that de-incentivized the team from drafting you, but the market would balance itself out at the end of the day. Like, it would find a happy medium there where the team knows, like, I need to automatically extend you, then like renegotiate after year one. And that would require, I think, obviously a new CBA too, drawing up those rules. But the concept of a player option in general, like, the negotiations have always been, in my eyes, very team friendly and
Mm-hmm.
team oriented in the NFL compared to other sports as it stands today. It's the only sport where you don't get guaranteed contracts too. And I mean, making that a thing would also make teams make more, like, conservative decisions in what kind of length of deal they're going to offer and just change things. So definitely ways to improve it. But I think the league isn't necessarily interested in improving either of those things at this point in time.
Yeah, no, I do love the player option idea where players can kind of choose whether they want to stay on the contract that they're on and guarantee themselves like the rookie contract or opt out of it and make the team negotiate it if their performance is capable of it. And I really like that idea. But yeah, it's a tough balance, I guess, between the NFL trying to keep the owners and the teams happy versus like the players making sure that they're getting their fair wages and everything as well, which makes it really tough. But and like the thing for me about the draft now is like I'm not going to say it's solved because like the player evaluation standpoint of it is still so tough and so random and there's so much variance. But like the discourse around the draft now has like basically been solved to a point where it's just this team took premium positions and didn't reach on players according to the consensus big board, so we like their draft versus this team didn't take premium positions and didn't maybe reached on some players, so we didn't like their draft, and like that's what like the discourse has been. So now if you throw in that new alternative rookie wage scale or rookie contract, that like kind of takes it from being somewhat figured out to all of us people like starting over on figuring out like what the optimal way is to handle those situations.
No doubt. I mean, I'd love to see something change in that regard because also you look at like undrafted free agency,
Mm-hmm.
like the majority of the people that are getting signed, one, they don't end up making the team, but like you've never heard of a lot of them.
Yeah.
And so the narratives too there of like if you shortened the draft and then like, oh, well, are the smart teams signing the guys that fell out of the first 3 rounds or whatever? If that's like all it was, then that is another like element of, well, there is real money to potentially be spent on the guy who didn't get drafted in the first 3 rounds, but I believe is a starter. I mean, that's what I would personally love to see is like the 4th round is where teams still feel they're like potentially getting a starter in some situations. It's got to be the right kind of positional fit. Well, if that's true, like some of those rookies could end up making like a lot of money. And then even if running backs don't end up getting drafted because of some other ripple effect rule, well, then they're just negotiating, like Saquon's negotiating his contract from day one at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Someone's going to give him over slot, if you will. You talk about like Major League Baseball slots and things like that to come sign for him. So
Yeah.
I think something changing in regards to structure with that would be the only way that you really solve it for all positions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm definitely with you, and I think hopefully that's something down the line that changes. But for now, I think the really smart teams will continue to use the draft to their advantage to make sure they're getting surplus value from their picks, and then use free agency to because they understand it's an efficient market and kind of plug the holes like when necessary there as well, and that. But yeah, John, this was great. Really enjoyed you coming on the show. Glad we got to do this. So for everyone out there listening, you can find John on Twitter at the real Papa John, which is a very funny username.
My college job was at Papa John's, so I was not a delivery driver. I made the pizza, and so I'm not even kidding. When I would walk in, sometimes my coworkers would literally say, "Papa's in the house," and it was like the most cringy thing of all time. But that's where the Twitter handle originated.
It would be cool if you had the story like you were the guy that gave Urban Meyer the Papa John's pizza when he was eating it after the playoff loss. I think that iconic picture that was taken.
Fortunately, no cool
But
stories like that.
yeah, but it's a very cool username. I'm glad that you got it. And yeah, for everyone out there, like he's currently the director of football strategy at True Media. So be sure to check out everything else that he's doing there, as well as another podcast he did on True Media's Expected Value podcast. John, anything else that you want to plug before we log off here?
No, I mean, so there will be a link to our company in my bio, and then I have that other interview pinned to the top of my timeline if anybody's interested in checking it out. We go into a little bit more detail in that on like my specific academic career, that if there's any kind of like more entry level people that are interested in like the steps to get to sitting in a seat like Tej has right now, it probably would apply a little bit more.
Mhm. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, definitely. People should definitely check that out. And yeah, Mojal has a question for you here in the chat. What's your best Papa John's pizza?
Oh, that's a tough one. So by far their chicken strips was my favorite thing, which they got rid of and was like it broke my heart. I love their pepperoncini peppers. That was like the one like unique thing that they did. I would always make a white pizza, so I like that. And then just with sausage and 6 cheese would be like the two things I would throw on it.
I
So
like that.
kind of
Yeah,
blessed.
that sounds good. I mean, yeah, it is getting close to dinner time here, hungry, but so
Yes, sir.
yeah, but yeah, for everyone listening out there as well, like be sure to check out our Twitter at Sumer Sports, the website sumersports.com got some pretty cool stuff that is about to go up pretty soon, and yeah, keep listening to the Super Sports show on YouTube, on Apple, on Spotify, wherever you want to listen to it, and if you're enjoying it, feel free to give us a review and let us know, like DM me or respond to me on Twitter, like if you want us to stream some live best ball drafts. It's something we've talked about but didn't know if there was going to be interest out there. So Eric Parker and I can definitely do that. So feel free to let us know as well. But thanks everyone for listening. Really appreciate all the comments as always. And until next time on the Sumer Sports Show.
Thanks, Dave.